Thank you, Alicia. Good afternoon, everyone, and wish you a belated Happy New Year. May 2022 be joyous and healthy for all of you. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you all this afternoon. So I want to start by thanking iFast for the opportunity to come and present to you, but also our partners in Malaysia, LGB Asset Management, who are bringing this exciting opportunity called the Climate Change Solutions. And it's my privilege to be presenting the investment case to you today. I know that several of the speakers that I'm sharing this forum with have spoken to you about sustainability, about ESG, and I'm actually quite pleased that they've teed up this conversation quite well, because a lot of them have focused on the need for investors to incorporate ESG into their portfolios. Through the course of my presentation today, I'm going to speak about three main aspects. I will speak to you about why climate change is the #1 challenge for humankind. It's not inflation, it's not market volatility, and it's not COVID. The #1 challenge in our lifetimes is climate change problems. I will also speak to you about the climate change solutions of JP Morgan Asset Management that's being brought to Malaysian investors through the RHB Climate Change Solutions Fund. How does it seek to invest into companies that provide products and services that offer solutions to these climate change problems? We will focus on not just companies that are trying to reduce their emission, but indeed companies that are trying to solve these climate change problems. Also, finally, on the third point, this strategy presents a compelling and unique opportunity, both from ESG perspective, but also from an investment growth perspective as well. So what I want you to remember is, while doing good for the planet, you can do well in your portfolio as well. So we're not here to appeal to the goodness of your hearts. We're here to strike a balance between doing good for the planet, but also doing well in our portfolios as well. So if that sounds like a reasonable agenda, let's launch into my first point. Why is climate change solutions the #1 problem for the world? What we've got for you here is a thermometer, which is showing you where we were close to about 100 years back in terms of global temperatures. And because of global warming, where we are today. And if we don't address this issue, even with the current commitments of governments and policymakers, they'll be likely to be. So you notice that first arrow in the bottom, pre-industrial levels. Since then, the current one, which is the red bar, we've warmed up the planet because of economic industrial activity. Greenhouse gas emissions, which are carbon dioxide, methane, and several other greenhouse gases, have contributed to the planet warming up by 1 degree since pre-industrial times. If we continue with the current commitments of governments, which is called the nationally determined contributions, or the efforts from governments to reduce carbon emissions, by the end of this century, the planet will heat up by 2.7 degrees. That's not sustainable. The planet cannot sustain that level of warming up. What scientists have discovered, and there's a far bigger consensus, that we can only afford to let the planet grow warmer compared to pre-industrial levels by 1.5 degrees centigrade only. That's the bigger room that we have, and which is why you've heard of COP26, you've heard of climate change issues, and governments focusing on it. And it's not just governments that are focused on it. If you go to the next slide, we see this widespread occurrence of climate-related issues across the world. I know there have been unfortunate floods in Malaysia in the recent times, but globally, these freak environmental episodes are taking place, which is not just leading to catastrophic loss of life, but also structural issues around economics, where it's creating, because of loss of employment and assets, it's leading to creation of new class of poor. So whether it's the hurricanes or tornadoes in the US, wildfires or the bushfires in Australia, even the developed countries are not immune to this, and it's affecting communities and societies at large. So it's obviously brought a lot of attention from the governments and policymakers. But if you go to the next slide, and I'm conscious we're on a Saturday afternoon, I just wanted to bring in Hollywood as well. Hollywood has also addressed this topic. Now, we are all hoping that whether it was The Day After Tomorrow or Interstellar, where Matthew McConaughey actually sets off on his search for finding a new planet that we can inhabit as human or mankind, because Earth has become unlivable, we all hope it's fiction. But there's plenty of attention that's been given on this as well. If we go to the next slide, let's try and address that issue and try and see, as investors, how do we do good and do well in our portfolios? So the challenge is for the world to address greenhouse gas emissions in a way that the climate warms up by just 1 more degree by the end of the century, which means that today we're emitting close to about 50 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions every year. Even at the current pace, if we don't address this, that number by 2050, which is less than 30 years from now, will go up by 50%, which means we would have emitted every year 75 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions. And that greenhouse gas emission is the #1 reason for climate change or global warming. So the opportunity here as investors is really to find those businesses and those companies which are involved in solving these problems through innovative new solutions. The one other thing that I will point out is that this strategy is not a technology strategy. Climate change solutions providers can be present anywhere in any part of any market, in any market capitalization, and in any sector. It can be industrials, it can be technology, it can be several other sectors as well. So it's important to be broad-based, which is what we are in this strategy. If you go to the next slide, this will be very important for us to look at. And I know one of the speakers through the course of the day today has addressed this, which is policy tailwinds. Now, many of us are familiar that when it comes to big tech, particularly consumer-facing technology, whether it's in the US or in China, there's been a lot of policy and regulatory headwinds. Whereas this field of climate change solutions has policy tailwinds because governments, institutions, and policymakers, all of them want to support companies and businesses and encourage them to solve these issues and climate change problems that we'll address just momentarily. So remember, what is headwinds for big tech or consumer-facing technology is actually tailwinds for companies which are trying to solve these climate change problems. Now, I must also admit, we're not speaking about climate change issues for the first time. I remember ancient history when I was in school, climate change was still a topic. So what's changed since then? What's changed is availability of technology that can be employed to address a lot of these climate change sources. For instance, one of the biggest sources I mentioned is carbon in the atmosphere. There is technology that exists today which can move air through machines that extract that harmful carbon and release the air without that carbon. The challenge is that that technology is expensive today, and therefore it's commercially not feasible right now. A lot like electric vehicles. Electric vehicles as a concept has been existing for at least 20 years. The reason we see that come into fruition over the last 3 to 4 years is because technology around electric vehicles has become a far more advanced and commercially feasible. And therefore, many speakers have alluded to electric vehicles as a very important and exciting sector, which we absolutely agree with. So the enhancement of technology over the past 1 to 2 decades has really allowed companies to innovate by using technology, even though they're not a technology company, but by using technology in order to solve these problems. Third, last but not the least, is consumer preferences. Not just you and I as consumers who are becoming more aware, but even the companies that we work for, whether it's iFast, whether it's LGB Asset Management, whether it's JP Morgan, all of us have our true North Star towards doing good for the planet while doing our business. So the patterns of consumption and operating in this environment are changing, and therefore there is will from institutions, individuals to incorporate better habits so as to grow in a manner which does not hurt the planet. So on the next slide, let's look at some of these commitments from some large countries. On the left-hand side, we're showing you China is right now the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. Not China's problem. Over the last 20 years, the West has outsourced its manufacturing to China, which is why most of the manufacturing, which typically leads to greenhouse gas emissions, is sitting in China right now. So China is emitting almost twice as much greenhouse gas emissions as the US, and incredibly more compared to EU. But here's the good news. China has committed for neutrality of greenhouse gas emissions, which means they will take out equal amount of carbon from the atmosphere as they will emit by 2060. Similarly, US and Europe actually have far more aggressive targets, 2050. 2050 means for US and Europe, they will have to sequester equal amount of carbon from the atmosphere as they can emit. Now, granted, these are 3-4 decades away, but given the scale of the problem, scale of the challenge, the work has started a few years back, in fact, several years back, and is getting accelerated as we speak. Which is why we believe what Bill Gates said earlier in our, just a quarter back, late 2021, that climate change solutions providers are likely to produce 8 to 10 winners over the future, whether you call them as Tesla, Google, Amazon, or Microsoft. We all know those are household names today. But just like 10, 15 years back, these weren't household names. As adoption of their technology enhanced, the growth in their stock prices improved. Similarly, these companies that are involved in solving these climate change problems, as they become more feasible, as investors take notice, will become the next fangs of the future. So if we go to the next slide, let's try and show you where do the opportunities or those compelling opportunities to strike that balance between sustainability or climate change solutions providers, and how are they good investment from a growth perspective as well. So the primary drivers of greenhouse gas emissions are given to you on the left-hand side. Generating electricity and heat, obviously, is the biggest contributor. So 1/4 of greenhouse gas emission comes from generating electricity and heat. But agriculture, farming, is the second largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, 24%, so almost a quarter. Making things like steel, concrete is another 21%. Warming buildings, heating buildings, another 6%. Going from point A to point B, taking flights, taking your cars and so on, transportation is about 14%. And the others constitute greenhouse gas emissions from waste. Remember, we are 7.6 billion people on the planet. We just generate a lot of waste, and which all of these put together leads to themes that we focus on the right-hand side. So looking at the sources of greenhouse gas emissions, these are the 5 broad themes, which is renewable electricity or renewable ecosystem, sustainable food and water, you can call it sustainable nutrition, which is how do you reduce greenhouse gas emissions from farming, sustainable construction, sustainable transport, and even making sure that the waste that we generate, we try and recycle and reuse that so that we lead to zero waste or potentially minimal waste. So if you go to the next slide, let's try and address some of these areas. Renewable and electrification clearly is the most prominent part today because plenty of work's been happening. Some speakers have spoken to you about wind farms, solar energy. Well, it's not just about providers of turbines to those companies, even those companies that provide the ecosystem of electrification, and we'll speak about some of them, will be beneficiaries as the world weans itself of coal-powered power station to more renewables. Sustainable construction, manufacturing steel and concrete are extremely dirty processes when it comes to releasing greenhouse gas emissions. Making 1 ton of steel and concrete emits 1 ton of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, it's not feasible for us to say, let's consume less of steel and concrete. That's just not going to happen. We are 7.6 billion people on the planet. Even if we assume population doesn't grow, you will see people transitioning or migrating from rural areas in emerging markets to urban areas. What's going on in Southeast Asia, China, India, that will lead to more consumption of concrete and steel. So the idea or the solution is not to say, let's consume less of this. If anything, we're going to consume more of it. The idea is to find processes by which you find ways of manufacturing this item with less amount of greenhouse gas emissions, or potentially find solutions like carbon capture, which actually captures that greenhouse gas emissions through those processes and cleans it before releasing the air into the atmosphere. Sustainable food and water. I mentioned 24% of greenhouse gas emissions happens from this segment, but also farming takes 70% of fresh water that's available on the planet today. So it's an extremely inefficient sector, but the reality again, we're going to have more people, we're going to have to feed more people, and as the population grows more affluent globally, they will need better nutrition, or they will be able to buy better nutrition, which is why we need to produce more. So again, you can't say let's farm less. It's an important area. The key really is to use artificial intelligence, GPS, and cloud computing to solve some of these challenges. For instance, let me give you an example. And I know that came in one of the presentations earlier. Deere, which is a global leader in making tractors, is now a leader in providing solutions towards precision farming. What is precision farming? Every seed that is planted in a field is actually collected as data point and logged onto a digital map. That digital map is then uploaded to cloud. That digital map is then released to sprayers, which Deere manufactures, which then spray water, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, specifically in those areas which need it. So if a certain area of the field, through artificial intelligence, you've determined is low on fertilizers, it emits a fertilizer there. If it needs water, it does that. Through this precision farming, farmers are able to reduce usage of water by 40% and usage of pesticides and herbicides by a staggering 80 to 90%. Not just reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but in the process, also saving costs for the farmer. So environmentally friendly, but also socially extremely valuable as well. Sustainable transport, many presenters have spoken about this, which is electric vehicles and the ecosystem around electric vehicles. Finally, recycling and reuse. Waste that humankind generates leads to greenhouse gas emission. It also leads to problems in the oceans where a lot of that waste gets collected. There are businesses which are solving very efficiently and are profitable companies, which we tend to be interested in this portfolio. So let's go to the next slide and speak about an ecosystem where some of these climate change solution providers come together. I spoke to you about sustainable transport. Some of the names that will be familiar to you will be CATL, which is a leading manufacturer of electric vehicle batteries, a China-based company, Contemporary Amperex Technology Limited. Also another EV manufacturer in China, Xiaopeng. But think about an electric vehicle. An electric vehicle clearly runs on electricity, not on diesel or petrol. But what if that electricity is generated by using thermal plants? That's an extremely inefficient way of running an electric vehicle, because ultimately, somewhere, coal is being burnt to generate that electricity. So the key is to electrify the world and the entire ecosystem with renewable energy, and which is where renewable and electrification is extremely important. So these big wind farms that you see off the coast of Scandinavia, that offshore wind farms are connected to the onshore grids through high capacity cables provided by names such as Prysmian. And even Schneider, that provides software and hardware to be able to connect this renewable energy, this precious source, to electricity grids that you and I then can tap into. I spoke to you about sustainable food and water, gave you one example of Deere, which is leading the world in precision agriculture, reducing waste and greenhouse gas emissions. But even names like Evoqua Water. Water is perhaps one of the most precious resources we have. So Evoqua is in the field of water and wastewater management. It transforms, even today, yearly, 4.5 billion gallons of water per day. 4.5 billion gallons of water is exactly the similar amount of water that flows over Niagara Falls every day. So really, companies that are offering solutions for the planet in the form of transforming wastewater into more potable water. Names like Tetra Tech, which are leading names globally in desalinization. Again, as there are more humans on the planet, we will need this precious resource more and more. And finally, there are names such as Tomra, which builds into that theme of recycling and reuse, which is essentially just as a human population, we generate close to 14 trillion cans or containers of drinks every year. That's a lot of drinks containers. Now, if we don't recycle that, that's a lot of waste, which leads to greenhouse gas emissions. All of us are familiar with vending machines. Tomra manufactures something called as reverse vending machine, which incentivizes consumers like me. Once I've taken a can of Coke, instead of chucking it into a waste bin, I can actually submit it in this reverse vending machine. I get, for that good behavior, some points, like your credit card points that you get from your bank for using the credit card. And Tomra is able to recycle that for use back into the industrial processes by selling it to industries and to companies in their manufacturing process. So really leading the way in circular economy with least waste. Tomra last year saved the world 155 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Again, a great name in the field, which naturally doesn't come to us intuitively. So hopefully I've given you a sense of where the opportunities exist. I'm going to spend 3 or 4 minutes on the way we capture these opportunities. Remember what I said. The opportunities in this emerging field of climate change solutions could be anywhere. It could be any part of the world. It could be any industry. It could be any market capitalization. Therefore, we want to start with the broadest opportunity set when it comes to identifying companies. So if we go to the next slide, let me show you how the process works. And this is where we bring in the power. Next slide, please. This is where the power of artificial intelligence comes in. So we use our fundamental equities team, our quantitative solutions team, and our sustainable investing team. On the next slide, if you go, this is where we use all these capabilities along with artificial intelligence. Start with the broadest opportunity set, which is 13,000 companies globally. Then using artificial intelligence and big data, identifying the most relevant companies which are highest on these themes using natural language processing. So the 5 themes that we spoke about. The artificial intelligence engine uses big data in the form of all the publications that are available, whether it's company filings, regulatory reports, fact-set data, sell-side brokerage reports, millions of data sources, which can't be seen through human eyes. It uses artificial intelligence to identify the 300 leading companies. That's when our fundamental team comes in to find which are the most attractive companies and captures those and finds the most 50 to 100 most attractive ideas then that we put in the portfolio. If you go to the next slide, this process of using artificial intelligence and fundamental then leads to this outcome, which is owning companies across different geographies, across different sectors and sub-themes, and across mostly mid, small, and large capitalization. We don't have giant cap, which is $1 trillion and above. As I mentioned, a lot of these are businesses which are not household names. And as you notice, top 10 holdings, these aren't your household names like technology names like Microsoft, Alphabet, Amazon, Apple. Those are tech names which are trying to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. What we're interested in are companies that are trying to solve these climate change problems. So the top 10 names, you notice many of them are industrial names, but really addressing different themes, whether it's sustainable construction or infrastructure, or for that matter, food and water, nutrition, and several other sectors that we address in our portfolio. So let's try and bring all of this together on the next slide. Remember what I started out with. It's not inflation, it's not COVID. The number one challenge for humankind is climate change. So it is the number one issue. This strategy of climate change solutions that we bring to you through RHP Climate Change Solutions Fund seeks to invest in companies that provide solutions to these issues. And finally, it's not just about doing good, which is important, but also through our fundamental research, artificial intelligence, and our ability to identify leading names that can solve these problems. It's also about doing well in your portfolio as well. With that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague from RHP, Jason Cho, to walk you through some of the main features of the fund. And I'll be happy to take questions after that. Thank you.
Thanks, Supreet. Yeah, for RHP Asset Management, we have offered the RHP Climate Change Solution Fund to funds investors and also iPass investors. So apparently, this is a fund aims to provide a long-term capital growth by investing to one of the collective investment scheme, that means investing in JP Morgan Climate Change Solution Funds. So apparently this funds is available in Malaysia. We just launched last week, and we have two currency class. One is ringgit hedge and also USD class. Next, please. Next page, please. All right, so this is on the feeder fund strategies where investors place the money into LGB Climate Change Solution Fund. And for us, we feed into JP Morgan Climate Change Solution Funds. That is the target fund managed by JP Morgan Asset Management. Okay. So next page, please. So this fund, as I mentioned, we launched on the 13th January 2022. Now it's still IoT period. And of course, this currency will be USD class. And we are offering two class in Malaysia. One is USD and also ringgit hedge class. So sales charge will be up to 5%. Of course, annual management fee is up to 1.8%. Annual trustee fee is 0.04%. So apparently, I think there is some promotion by Fund Supermart. If you invest prior this period of time, you get a special arrangement. Yeah, next page, please. So minimum initial investment is USD $1,000 or ringgit Malaysia 1,000 ringgit on the ringgit cash class. So apparently this is it. Over to you, Alicia.
All right, thank you, Jason, so much for the fun description. And let us move on to our Q&A session.
Okay.
All right. Just a moment, yeah. Okay, so there's one question for you, Mr. Supreet. Yes. So the new technology to address climate change will be capital intensive. Yeah. Would the fund requires very long-term investment horizon?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a great question. Let's just first of all address the issue here. Nobody on this call and nobody in the planet expects these climate change to be solved within the next 6 months or a year's time. But there's plenty of support from governments towards institutions to try and find those solutions that can offer hope to the planet to address these issues. So I agree with you. Just like, let me take a step back. How many of you wish that you would have held Amazon 10, 15 years back in your portfolio? Of course, it's become a household name today. Many of us wish we had identified NVIDIA in our portfolios 6 or 7 years back. So my argument to you is that if you feel like that, some of these household names, as Bill Gates had mentioned, and I alluded to, that many of the next mega caps are likely to come from the field of climate change solutions. The idea is to capture this investment theme early so that you can benefit with it as these companies become more household names and become giant caps and mega caps over a period of time. So I absolutely agree with you. Do not view this as a 6-month investment. Have a longer term view. And as I mentioned, these problems will not solve themselves over the next 6 months. Like technology and technology adoption and evolution didn't take place in 6 months. It took several years, but the stock prices can tend to discount the future growth quite early as well. We just don't know when. So it's important to be invested when that realization and discounting of the opportunity of growth comes into stock prices. So I would argue, yes, have a longer term time frame in holding this portfolio.
I see. So the time frame is usually how many years would you recommend for our investor to hold for these climate change funds?
Alicia, I would say any equity investment needs to be holding period of 2 to 3 years at the very least. For a strategy like this, if you can have a horizon of 3 to 5 years, even better.
3 to 5 years. All right. Okay. So and then another question is right here. Yeah. So what's your long-term outlook overall on the general climate change industry?
Yes. Thank you for the question. It's an emerging field. It is where, as I mentioned, where technology and disruptors in technology were perhaps 10 years back. So as adoption of technology improved over the last 10 years, like cloud computing, digital transformation, and so on, technology names benefited from it. Similarly, hopefully, I've been able to present to you that governments, institutions, and policymakers are laser focused on this issue. And as companies come up with feasible solutions and ideas, as I presented, like Dale, like Tomra, and some of the other names that I spoke about, like Evoqua, you will see more and more momentum behind some of these industries and some of these names. Remember what I said, climate change solution providers don't sit in just one sector. They're not tech companies. They can be industrials, they can be tractor manufacturers or agriculture and farming companies, or they could be water, wastewater desalinization companies. They sit across multiple areas. So we're quite optimistic, but again, don't take a 6-month view. You need to have a longer term view in an opportunity like this.
All right. And are those companies that this fund is investing are compliant to the ESG sector?
Oh, it is. Alicia, that's a great question, and thank you for the question. The portfolio is actually extremely high on characteristics which feature very favorably on ESG characteristics. So whether it's environmental impact, clearly showing that it's an ESG fund, a climate change solutions fund, is extremely strong in terms of its environmental characteristics, even social characteristics, like doing something for the community. One of the names which was there on one of my slides was Signify, which is the holding company for a brand which we popularly known as Philips, which is doing leading work in electrification of remote areas in my home country of India and many other emerging markets, which are not connected to electricity grid. So they're providing solar solutions to these remote areas, which are currently not linked to the regular electricity grid. So this portfolio actually features extremely high on ESG characteristics. I'm just going to make a quick comment. European classification, which is perhaps the most developed one, Alicia, which says classification of ESG funds. This fund is at the highest level of ESG classification amongst all funds available in Malaysia. For your reference, it's called SFTR classification. All ESG funds in Malaysia are currently Article 8. This fund is Article 9. In summary, that's the gold standard of ESG funds.
I see. It's very good to know that. Yeah, but a lot of us didn't know about this. Yeah. Thank you so much for the information. And the time is almost up, Mr. Supreet, and thank you so much for your sharings today. Indeed, for me, myself, it's really an eye-opening session for me, because we do talk about a lot of about technology and stuff. Yeah, thank you so much for Mr. Supreet joining us today.
Thank you for the opportunity, and have a great weekend ahead and the rest of the year as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.